Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint this misty scene by just using one color, and that color will be Payne's Grey Bluish by Schmincke. You can see that on the right I have my bleed proof white, and that's because I made a mistake and forgot to leave out some white negative space, so I'm going to use bleed proof white as well, but it's completely optional. This is the reference image that I'm going to work from. I love the misty look of it and the simplicity of this composition. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the original link as I've forgotten to save it. If you open the link in my description box, it's actually a mirrored version of this image, but I've edited and flipped the image so it looks like the original image that I used for this painting. Before painting everything, I'm going to use a washi tape to mask the edges just to give a clean frame. I'm going to start by using my large flat brush to evenly dampen the surface using clean water. I'm only going to dampen the surface very lightly at this point since I will be introducing more wet paint with a heavy load to paint the light background. I'm starting with a light consistency and I'm going to cover the whole page. Then with a thicker consistency, I'm going to add it to the corners, making them slightly darker for a vignette effect. While I'm still using my flat brush, I'm also going to indicate the darker areas that I can see from the reference image. I'm still painting fairly lightly at this point though, because I'm just going to build it up slowly and layer on more paint as I go. I'm also going to indicate the area of the land or the islands on the sides so I can estimate the rest of the elements. By the way, due to the simplicity of this reference, I wanted to try to approach painting this freehand, but you can also section out your page with pencil beforehand if you feel like it'll help to visualize the spacing. And here I'm painting the top so I can separate the land and the water. Here I'm switching to my small brush to start painting on the land in a bit more detail so the edges are not as messy. I'm still using a fairly watery load so the paint will still disperse and become lighter as it dries. I'm also going to paint on the left hand side, then dry it off completely. Once the whole page is completely dry, I'm going to start painting on the tree growing out of this land. I want the trees to have some character, so I made the trunk a bit wavy. I feel like this adds a bit of mystery to the atmosphere. And just to make sure when you're painting on the trees that the trunk at the bottom is slightly thicker to support the weight. I'm going to paint a few trees, and to help with the misty effect, I want to make sure that the trees placed behind will be lighter than the ones in front. I'm going to use more or less the same consistency to paint the foliage on top. I want to cover a fairly large area by dotting with the tip of this brush. Then to make the edges look more textured, I switched to a Chinese calligraphy brush, but if you've been here a while, I don't really know what the brand is because it was just an old brush that was gifted to me. You can also use a frayed brush to create those textures though, so it's optional. I haven't painted these types of scenes for a while, so I'm a bit rusty with the consistency measurement. Here I felt like the tree was a bit too light, so I darkened it, and I also added more layers for the foliage using a slightly thicker consistency so it looks like some foliage are slightly closer to us. Once the land at the back is dry, it blurred out a bit too much for my liking, so I just went over it again to slightly redefine it, and I'm just going to wait for it to dry, and meanwhile I'm going to paint the land in front. I'm using a thicker consistency, and before everything completely dries off, I'm going to switch to a clean damp brush and pull the bottom of this island or land downwards for the water reflection. To make this look slightly like water, I'm just going to direct my brush horizontally so it looks like a flat surface. Next, I want to make sure everything's completely dry, and I want to darken the background, so I decided to use a thin consistency to just give a really light wash over the tree on the right hand side to make it look a bit hazy. But on the left side, I want the background to be lighter, so I just softened and blurred out the edges using a clean damp brush. For the land on the left, I want to use a really thick consistency to make it look very dark. I also switched to my synthetic brush so the bristles won't absorb too much water, which makes it much easier to paint thickly. Around the edges, I try to make it look like there is some grass sticking out since this land is closer to our viewpoint, so I want to include a bit more detail. Then just like the land before, I painted the reflection. This time I just used a thinner consistency instead of pulling so it won't take off more pigment. Then I created the water texture by using my fan brush to make uneven horizontal lines. Then right before the paint dries, I pulled it vertically to make it look more blurry. Next, I'm going to darken the area of the water. The bottom corners are very dark, so I just used a thick consistency. Then I switched to my large flat brush so I can cover a large amount of surface area. I'm just going to place it very roughly according to the dark parts from the reference image. Then to create the water texture, I like to move it horizontally to connect the two sides. And while the surface is still damp, I switch to my small brush and pick up a really thick consistency again. This way, the damp surface can help the darker value to naturally spread and it creates less harsh edges. Once I get towards the center though, you can see that the page is fairly dry because I left out some white negative space as well. But that's okay, I'm just going to try to keep it moving horizontally. If I feel like I need to add a lot more water, I will just switch to my larger soft brush, which will soften the edges further because this brush can hold more water. I'm just going to add the darker values little by little, but when I feel like the paper can't really take or absorb any more water, I'm just going to dry everything off completely before adding any more paint or adding any more layers with a hairdryer. Since I've placed the darker values on the water, I feel like the land here needs to be darkened. Since I already have a base layer, I'm going to use the thicker, darker color to paint a bit more detail and texture for the ground. And I'm also going to add more trees on top. I'm going to use the same brush to paint the trees, and I'm also using a thick consistency because I want the trees here to be in front of the previous ones that we've painted. So this one is darker and more defined. The land on the left is also a bit faded once it's dry, so I'm going to layer a thicker consistency on top, and I'm going to layer a medium consistency for the land at the back. By the way, I'm pretty sure this painting can be accomplished with less layers if you have the sensibility to control and visualize how much your paint will fade as it dries. Unfortunately, I'm not that experienced, and it's been a while since I painted value paintings using only one color, so I will be going back and forth to layer on darker values, especially as I try to break down the image from the reference. But I'd have to say that this is much easier to lightly layer and add more paint than accidentally painting something too dark in the beginning, then having to take it off. Here I'm going back to the water to layer a darker value for the reflections now that the surrounding value is slightly darker. I'm still using the same technique as I did before to create the water texture. At the bottom on the reference, it seems like the dark value is coming from the reflection of the surrounding area, maybe like a reflection of trees which are on top of the water. I can't really make out the specific shapes, so I'll just try to recreate and suggest the overall feeling of the painting. I can see that the lines are slightly vertical, so I added vertical lines really randomly using a thick consistency. And on the right, since it's a bit more blurry, I just paint with the same horizontal motion. Now switching to my dry fan brush, I'm going to run the vertical lines across horizontally so it looks like the water is flat. Then since I feel like the vertical lines were a bit too rough, I decided to paint on some leaves as reflections so the reflections look a bit more organic. After that, I'm going to blur out the leaves again using my dry fan brush. On the left, I decided to add more trees. I know that it's not there in the reference, but I feel like adding more trees makes the composition look a bit more mysterious somehow. So I'm going to add a lot more for my composition, especially later for the background. But for this one, since it's quite close to our viewpoint, I want to add a lot of detail, and I'm also trying to paint in a very thick consistency with my synthetic brush. Since this is just mainly a silhouette, the way I try to add the detail of the tree trunk is by making the edges slightly uneven and jagged as if it's slightly textured. For this tree, I want the branches to run almost all across to the other side. This way the placement of the foliage can be more dynamic. For the foliage, I'm just trying to use a thick consistency and a heavy brush load to cover a large surface area, especially for the top corners. Then to make the edges slightly more textured and a bit more believable, I switched to my Chinese calligraphy brush to make the randomized leaf textures. While adding on the foliage and the leaves, I try to make them somewhat make sense that they're growing out of the branches that I painted earlier. And if I want to fill in more space but there are no branches, it really helps to at least draw one or a couple more small branches. Then you can make the foliage grow out from the branch and even branching out further from the ones that you previously painted. I also want to add some younger leaves on the main tree trunk. I feel like this helps it look a bit more natural to suggest different growth stages. I'm also going to add some grass textures for the edges of the land or the ground. After I've painted the tree and more foliage in the foreground, I felt like the background looks a bit too empty. This is probably due to poor scaling as well, as I was trying to compose it in the beginning. But I also wanted to include more trees anyway, which I'm going to place in the background. And I'm using a medium consistency because I know that this is going to lighten as it dries off. This part is actually really fun to paint. I really enjoyed filling in the space with some wavy and curvy trees. Just like the previous trees though, you want to make sure that the tree trunk is slightly thicker right at the bottom when it's attached to the ground so it can support the full weight. After painting a few trees, I'm going to add a thin wash over them to make the trees look more distant and the atmosphere a bit more foggy. Since the ground looks too light compared to the trees that I just painted, I'm just going to add another layer and then paint more trees on top. I'm going to add some grass at the bottom, but because I'm painting it lightly here, once it dries it won't stand out too much and it'll actually be quite subtle. Now I'm going to add more finer branches with more foliage, darker than the ones that I've painted so far so it looks further in front or closer to us, but I'm going to still vary the values and paint some lighter ones as well. And as we build this up, we will be suggesting more depth in the composition. This time I'm going to stick to my synthetic brush because I feel like I can paint in a thicker consistency with it since the bristles are a little bit more stiff compared to the calligraphy brush. And I also want to show you that it's doable to paint the textures of the leaves with a regular brush, though it takes a bit more effort and a bit more control. For the foliage at the top, it doesn't really matter too much what the shapes are because the background is fairly dark and it looks quite abstract, but I want to be very careful with the leaves that I'm painting on top of a light background. I love painting small details like leaves on branches, so I'm going to keep adding more until I feel like I have enough in the composition, and I just feel like by adding these small details, it kind of brings the whole painting together. For some extra touches, I want to add some branches which are almost touching the water. I feel like this adds a little bit more character and it also brings a bit more delicateness into the composition. In the foreground, I'm going to redefine the reflection on the water. So here I'm going to intentionally paint some vertical branches with some leaves growing out of it. It doesn't have to be very neat though, since again I am painting on a dark background, so it's not too visible. Then I'm going to add the water texture by using my flat brush again and moving it horizontally. All that's left now is to balance out the values. I'm going to darken some areas if it needs to be darker, and then I'm going to add the lone duck in the middle of the lake once I'm completely happy with the environment. You can paint the duck freehand, but I'm not confident in my skill enough since this is right in the middle and it's going to be painted on a light background. So instead of doing that, I made sure to draw it with pencil first and just fill in the shape with a really thick consistency, and also adding the reflection. This is also where I use bleed-proof white to add the water trail behind the duck, but this can actually be avoided by masking the area beforehand. If you want to go that route though, I feel like you have to draw the duck beforehand so you know the exact area to mask. I've forgotten to add some reflections of the trees since it wasn't in the original image. I actually added some on the left, but I think when it dried, it kind of end up disappearing. So if you want to do that, try to use a slightly thicker consistency. I also try to do the same on the right hand side. Then I'm going to just add more of the water texture, especially behind the duck. Finally, I'm going to unmask everything to reveal the painting, and that's it for this one. This was a bit challenging for me, as all landscapes are, but I learned so much, especially when it comes to different bristles and how much the water load affect the values. If you found this video useful, please consider subscribing for more tutorials that I post every Friday. The list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!